Hi, my little GOPO strawberries. It's Mrs. Thorson again, talking about elections and campaigns and nominations and all that fun stuff. We're going to go over a few sections today. First, we're going to talk about how individual choices, as well as different laws in the state and federal governments, influence voter turnout. So, we're looking at voter turnout. We're also going to look at voting behavior. So first is like who shows up and why and how things affect that. The second, we're going to look at why people vote or how people vote. And then the third, we're going to look at the Electoral College and how that's in the Constitution. All right, so let's see if I can push present right here. See if it'll work for me. So first of all, we're going to talk about different types of voting behavior and how the disenfranchisement of voters caused a lot of it where people weren't voting. But because of suffrage or franchisement, people have the right to vote, and that has extended a lot. 5 of the 17 amendments after the Bill of Rights were solely about franchisement or suffrage, the right to vote. The 26th Amendment made it where 18-year-olds could vote. The 24th Amendment said that you don't have to pay to vote. It should be free. And that's known as a poll tax. States used to require you to pay to vote, and they're like, no, that's stupid. They should be free. So what shapes people voting? Like what shapes our voter turnout? Well, usually we actually have very low voter turnout in the United States. And there's several reasons why. Number one, it can be difficult. We have ours on a Tuesday. So people work. We also have it where certain groups don't necessarily get involved. People tend to, who are poor or who have less education or who are younger, tend not to vote as much as older people. And then, of course, we see the biggest turnout in presidential election years, just because that's kind of like the most glamorous time to vote. But that's once every 4 years. We're voting all the time. At least once a year, you have the opportunity to vote. And most of it's on like state and local stuff, which actually affects you more than even the national level. So what are some of these influences that determine whether we vote? Well, one of them is socioeconomic status. That's the number one. That's the thing that James Madison talked about in Fed 10. He said the biggest source of faction is the unequal distribution of property. He's talking about wealth. He's talking about the income gap. And Americans with higher levels of SES tend to participate more in elections because they can donate to campaigns, they join interest groups, and then they get more invested, and they're definitely going to vote more likely. But the number one thing that influences our vote is education. The more educated you are, the more you're likely to vote because you have more vested in the system. So this is just kind of showing you over time that you can see that orange represents people who have voted. And the other one is maybe either they're not, blue is registered, but they might not have voted. And yellow is not registered. So we have a large population, and you can see over the graph that the more education you have, the more likely you are to vote. Because this was the percentage of voters in the 2016 election according to their education. Another reason why people vote is due to political efficacy. They believe their vote can make a difference. And the lower people's political efficacy is, the less likely they are to vote. So a good example is a lot of people in Illinois tend to have low political efficacy because they feel like, well, Illinois is always blue, so does my vote really matter? And I'm talking Democrats and Republicans feel that way. But like in a battleground or a swing state like a Florida, people tend to have higher political efficacy because they feel like, well, it could go either way, so they tend to vote more in those states. Another thing that changes our participation is your age. Younger people tend to not vote as much as the older generations, but you also factor into the fact that older Americans tend to have higher levels of income. So these traits are cumulative. The more of them you have, it even makes you more likely to vote. So meaning if you add up, when it comes to age, older people tend to vote. But what if you're older and you have a higher income status, and you have a higher education, that just all of those are cumulative. That makes you even more and more and more likely to vote. What about race and gender? The highest turnout rate for race are white people. However, when you add in someone's education, you tend to see people of color being more equal in political participation via voting to white people in America, for the fact that they, with the more education, that kind of brings up their voting participation rates. Women vote at a higher rate than men. It's about like 5% higher than men. So as you can see here, this is looking at, let's going back to what I said about age. You can see here, here's the data. It shows that younger people over time tend to have a lower turnout rate than older people. And you're like, well, why does this look like Homer Simpson's hairline or the zigzags on Charlie Brown's shirt? It's like that because the lower parts, if you notice, are not presidential election years. Those are known as midterm elections. The elections that happen halfway between a presidential election, that is basically just a third of the senators and all of the House of Representatives, but no president. And here you can see that we're looking at 3 different racial groups. We're looking at white, black, and Hispanic. And you can see that whites have the highest turnouts over time, but it's not too far off. You know, it's not that big of a difference. And actually the Hispanic election result turnout has actually grown in the past couple of elections. Another way that people vote is based on candidate. There is this thing called the Obama effect, which could be a cause for an increase in voter turnouts among African Americans. I'm going to skip this page, but if you go here, you can see right here that this is right here, 08 and 2012. We saw a big voter turnout, and we're thinking it could possibly be because of the Obama effect, because President Obama was our first African-American president, so we see a larger increase in voter turnout for Black Americans. What are some other things that people look at when it comes to their president, when it comes to characteristics? If you look at this graph on the right that shows a bunch of traits, this chart on the right that shows a bunch of traits, you can see what's like the least important to them. And if you look on here, probably some of the least important things were more about religion than anything. You can see people didn't really care if they were Catholic or Christian or Jewish or Mormon or, Muslim, and atheists were people cared a little bit more about that, but that was probably the biggest one. Had an extramarital affair, that one's that people are like, I don't really care about that anymore, which is probably good because pretty much most politicians tend to do that. All right, so how do politicians get these people out to vote? That's known as political mobilization. So they it's the efforts by political parties that say, go out and vote, get your neighbor to do it, get their neighbors to do it, get your family members, 10s and 20s, and get all the people you can, get them out to vote. And when you do, please vote for party line. That's the partisan attachment. They're like, go out and vote for us. But there are things that can influence voter turnout that are structural, not demographic. So all the things I just talked about is like the type of person you are that typically means like if you will or will not vote. But there's other legal and institutional factors that can influence voter turnout as well. And one of those is being registration requirements. So when you vote, you have to register to vote, and every state makes those laws differently. So some places, most Americans, in all the country, most Americans are eligible. All you got to do is be 18, not be a felon, and be a legal citizen of the United States. But sometimes people don't register, and certain states have registration rules where there's a cutoff date. Other states require proof of residency or an ID, and that can be disenfranchising to certain groups who don't have that proof of residency or state IDs. Like I was saying before, another thing that is an institutional factor that can influence voter turnout is our election day is on a Tuesday. It's a normal work day, and a lot of people have problems with that. Um, and another thing that can influence voter turnout that can help, if you don't live inside the state at the time of the election, you could get an absentee ballot. So that's an attempt to try to influence voter turnout, increase it. So if you look at all these states, you can see 16 of the 50 states do allow same day voter registration, which is meant to help increase voter turnout, Illinois being one of them. This one shows, do states make you show some form of ID? If it's gray, they cannot require you to show ID. If it's red, you have to show ID and you cannot use a student ID. Green and yellow are basically like you have to have an ID, but we are accepting lots of different types. And these are 38 of the 50 states have allowed for online registration, which again is meant to help increase voter turnout. But you can see that over time, that voter turnout hasn't really, comparing voter turnout of president and midterm elections, you can see that the green is midterm, the purple is presidential, even though a lot of these states are doing things like allowing same day registration, like not making you show an ID to vote, like allowing online registration, easier things that could increase voter turnout, it really hasn't made much of a difference in voter turnout. All right, so why is voter turnout lower in the United States and other democracies? I want you to think about that. And what steps could states and national governments take to increase voter turnout? You can think about think about on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, what Governor Pritzker did in Illinois that increased voter turnout. Think about that. And that's something that some states are doing.